Now, our last speaker here today is Persson, who is actually received his PhD in political science here at Lund University in political science, and who are now based at the Linneus University. Anders' profile here and research interest is focused on the European Union and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has written several books on this topic, on EU diplomacy, and more broadly also on the Israeli-Arab conflict from a longer also historical perspective. Some of you may also recognize Anders from being somebody who actually comment in TV and Swedish radio quite regularly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as also writing some articles for different newspapers like the Jerusalem Post, Politico, EU, and EU Observers, and many others. Today, you will be talking on what the war on terrorism did to the democratization in the Middle East. So welcome back, Anders, and the floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon and listening to us. I'm the last of us to talk today, and I think it's striking that how my colleagues have said that it's how difficult it is to make predictions, and especially about the future. And I was sort of thinking that since I grew up, I have experienced sort of 5 sort of big events that were more or less impossible to predict: 9/11, the tsunami, the financial crisis, the Arab Spring, and the pandemic. And the only sort of major prediction that sort of people are actually waiting for to happen would be an environmental 9/11, sort of losing an American or European city in an environmental disaster. That is sort of, I think, the only one which sort of people can agree upon. I won't talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. I've been talking about that a lot lately. My topic today is what the war on terrorism did to the Middle East, to democracy in the Middle East, and also to Europe. I think that we are exiting this period in history right now. I think that it will be remembered as a sort of interim phase between 2 Cold Wars. The previous, of course, with the Soviet Union, and the coming with China. And people are often defined by wars. My grandparents were defined by the Second World War. My parents were defined by the Cold War. And my generation was defined by this, the war on terrorism. And of course, I think my children's generation will be defined by the confrontation with China, which probably will take the form of a Cold War, at least initially. This phrase, the war on terrorism, was coined 20 years ago by George Bush. It was actually called the global war on terrorism. It was criticized from the first second, every word of it. People said, will this be a global campaign? Is war the best method? And isn't terrorism a tactic? How on earth do you wage war on this? And of course, the key question, how will victory be defined? When do we know that we have won? These questions came to plague the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who were won and lost several times before the US packed off and left, which was the right thing to do. There was no path to victory in Afghanistan. Instead, the war on terrorism was self-perpetuating, creating even more and dangerous enemies as it progressed. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and even ISIS-K, who blew up part of the airport before the Americans left. They drained resources from the US, and if somebody asked who won the war on terrorism, of course China did. And it also left large parts of the Middle East in ruins, literally. Here is Freedom House's data for the members of the Arab League, 2001, 2011, and 2021. So I made sort of 3 3 years here. Keep in mind that all the years here, sort of Freedom House 2021 is actually for the year before and so on. So the data is from the year before. The thing here they're measuring political rights and civil rights. These are and 1 is the best and 7 is the worst. The point to be made here is that most of the states look pretty much the same. So there are some countries where it's a little bit better, some countries where it is a little bit worse, many countries where it is much or less the same. The big thing here, basically the only thing that strikes out is that Tunisia is much, much better. So that's sort of the only country where we have seen a major change for the better. Until now. I'm going to speak a little bit more about Tunisia on the next slide. Palestine it's worse. It's been divided into 2 parts, Gaza and the West Bank. And of course I could add Israel, Turkey and Iran here also. They're of course not members of the Arab League. I can give you sort of Rosbe said that democracy wasn't perhaps that important and that the governance was more important. I agree to a certain extent, but it's also important, I think, to keep in mind that if we take my case, Israel and Palestine, 15 years ago, the Palestinians, even under conditions of occupation, were among the freest and most democratic societies in the Middle East. Having just for I think that it's the first time in modern history had a successful transition of power. An opposition party won. It was not a small, it was a major thing. And today, the Palestinians are in free fall. Gaza is one of the most authoritarian societies in the world. And democracy in the West Bank, it cannot be called democracy, but the freedoms there is also in free fall. That, of course, I think has effect for conflict resolution. We see the same thing in Israel. Israel was long called the only democracy in the Middle East. That's wrong. It's factually wrong. Tunisia is also a democracy. But Israel today, I don't have it here on the data, but Israel today is more authoritarian and less democratic than it has ever been. So how, of course, these authoritarian trends affect conflict resolution is also important, I think, to raise. We go on to sort of the $10,000 question. Why are there so few Arab democracies? This is a key question, very important question. If you have nothing to do, on a Friday night before you go to bed, I could sometimes lie for hours and think about this. This is sort of one of my sort of life questions, and another one is why we saw a religious revival in 77, 78, and 79 all over the world. And that's another sort of big life questions. Making a long story short, one can say that there are many types and many different explanations. That is often sort of a sign that people have no idea. Another related example would be the First World War. A lot of different explanations for why it happened. It's the same thing here. One can sort of put them on a scale of left to right, which is also another form of employing the structure versus agency perspective. Structure here is often sort of emphasized by people on the left, saying there is little democracy because of wars and rivalries and resources and foreign invasions. Whereas people on the right would say, no, it's because of sort of local factors like local culture and the role of Islam and these kind of things. Other explanations, the role of the military, security services, mukhabarat, the oil curse, bad governance, bad economic policies, weak civil societies, lack of an autonomous middle class, and so on and so forth. Again, many of these could be true at the same time. I think the point is that both sort of structural arguments and agency arguments are true, and that's one of the reasons why we have it the way we have it. Tunisia is an important case here. And to making a long story short about Tunisia, it was the last research trip I did before Corona to study the democracy movement in Tunisia. One can say that it's a very successful political model, but a completely failed economic model, which sort of taps into what previous speakers have said. Just to give you a few examples. In the place where the Arab Spring broke out, Sidi Bouzid in inland Tunisia, started by a young university graduate, Mohamed Bouazizi, who put himself on fire because he couldn't stand the abuse from police. 90% of the entrepreneurs, people with their own companies in that city, worked in the informal sector, basically on the black market. 90% of people in his town lived in informal housing, meaning houses that are not recognized by the state. Difficult to sell them, difficult to take out a mortgage on them. Which is sort of the foundation for the middle class in much of the Western world. The broader point here is that across the region, tens of millions of people are living, working, and dying in the informal sector. That is sort of the basic of the economic model. I only have 27 seconds left, so I will finish off by saying another key point of Tunisia about the economy is that they have huge subsidies, So you can buy, for example, a bottle of milk for 1 crown, subsidized by the state. It means that the milk producers take all the milk, sell it to Libya, So you have subsidies, low prices, but no milk. The point to make here is that a lot of things in the Middle East are on fire right now. And the point for us here in Europe is that we cannot be safe if our neighbors' houses are on fire. Thanks a lot.